Welcome to the McNees Food and Beverage podcast series. This podcast will address supply chain agreements by Peter Kriete, attorney at law. Mr. Kriete is co-chair of the Food and Beverage Group and also practices in corporate and tax, estate planning, venture capital and emerging companies, and automotive dealership law groups at McNees.
Three recent unrelated occurrences in the food industry share something in common: the recall of sunflower seed kernels, the Vermont GMO labeling law, and a recent lawsuit against Anheuser-Busch underscore the need for food manufacturers to understand and control their supply chain. Beginning in early May of this year, a recall of sunflower kernels contaminated with Listeria monocytogenes began. Since early May, there have been more than 30 separate recalls of products containing contaminated or potentially contaminated sunflower kernels. The recalls cover a variety of products, including packaged roasted sunflower kernels, salads, trail mixes, nut mixes, granola bars, and candy mixes. Watching almost daily recalls of products containing sunflower seeds provides a roadmap of the distribution chain of this product. Vermont's Act 120, which was enacted in 2014, was slated to go into effect July 1st of this year. Shortly after its effective date, the law was preempted by Senate Bill 764. The Vermont law would require that all food products manufactured with genetically engineered ingredients be labeled appropriately, using three different legends. The new Senate bill requires that the USDA develop labeling regulations for food products containing GMO ingredients within the next 2 years. Complying with this law will require food manufacturers to verify the status of all of the inputs into their product in order to make a determination as to the status of the finished product so that it can be labeled appropriately. These developments highlight the fact that food manufacturers can no longer afford the luxury of doing business with their suppliers solely on a purchase order basis. Every food manufacturer should have written agreements with its suppliers which outline their respective duties and responsibilities. At a minimum, a supply agreement should contain the following: a certification from the supplier as to the GMO status of the inputs it is selling, procedures for dealing with inadvertent inclusion of genetically engineered inputs that have not been previously disclosed, a representation and warranty that the inputs that are supplied will be wholesome and free from contamination and harmful microorganisms, a requirement that the supplier be subject to periodic audits of its processes in order to ensure adequate food safety, a procedure for handling recall of contaminated inputs, and appropriate indemnification provisions to provide for reimbursement of the manufacturer's cost if an input causes a recall, a requirement that the supplier maintain adequate insurance, including recall insurance covering accidental contamination, government recall, malicious product tampering, and insured product extortion with adequate limits of insurance to cover the manufacturer's costs. Issues also come into play on the other side of the chain, where a distributor's actions can create liability for a manufacturer. Recently, Anheuser-Busch was sued in North Carolina for infringing on the intellectual property of the Lumbee tribe of Native Americans. A local distributor of Budweiser put up point-of-sale materials that incorporated both Budweiser marks and the logo of the Lumbee tribe. The tribe objected to the unauthorized use and has sued the distributor and Anheuser-Busch for infringing on its marks. This highlights the need for food manufacturers to have written agreements with their distributors as well. These agreements should contain a provision that the distributor will use the manufacturer's intellectual property only in a manner approved by the manufacturer, an agreement by the distributor that the products will be handled and stored appropriately, procedures for handling recalls, appropriate indemnification provisions to provide for reimbursement of the manufacturer's costs if the distributor's actions create liabilities for the manufacturer, a requirement that the distributor maintain adequate insurance, including recall insurance with adequate limits of insurance to cover the manufacturer's costs. Food manufacturers who enter into supply and distribution arrangements without adequate safeguards are risking significant costs in the event of contamination or potential contamination of the inputs that they purchase, or costs arising from the distributor's actions. To learn more about this topic, please contact me using the information on the following screen.